Hi, I'm Bob Gimlin, and I'd like to read a unique Sasquatch encounter that I received recently. Here it goes. Hi, Bob. My name is Jay, and my life began to decline in 2018. My Army career failed, and so did my marriage, which coincided with the drinking problem. No, the drinking wasn't the cause of the failures. It was the result of them. For reasons not totally clear, the loss that devastated me the most during that time was that of my cat. I had rescued him and raised him from just a tiny kitten. He'd been with me since I was just a teenager, and the decision to end his fight against feline leukemia was the roughest decision of them all, for some reason. The drinking, the marriage, the career, the Mr. Mittens were all factors in why I decided to take a one-way trip to the mountains of Central Virginia, equipped with only a handle of bourbon and paracord. I wrote goodbye letters to friends and family, and neatly stacked them on the coffee table. And then I drove 2 hours west, to ensure that no one who knew me would be involved in the search, or more accurately, I suppose, the find. I was almost 2 years sober at that point, and strangely enough, just having the bottle there with me was satisfying enough. I tell you this because I want you to know that I was completely sober for my sighting. I parked at a rest stop and walked into the woods. There was a little trail which I used to get to the woods, but then I left it, and just walked in. No, I wouldn't exactly say that I was a woodsy person, but I had gone hunting as a teenager, and living in a rural area, I was no stranger to it. I was comfortable in the woods, if that's what you mean. Evidently, I decided to walk up, and I had walked long enough to feel it in my calf muscles, and to feel the pressure shift in my ears, probably about an hour. Sometimes I wonder if it was this incline, this gentle gradient upward, that saved my life. See, I hadn't taken a drink in almost 2 years, 649 days to be exact. And when I wrote those wicked letters, and on that sadistically neutral drive, what kept me going was the thought of breaking that bottle's seal. But it was weird. It felt like just having it there was enough. Having the option to drink it satisfied me to the point that I didn't actually feel the need to. Maybe it was the endorphins released by the uphill climb that satisfied me. Or maybe it's because walking uphill is tiring work, and bourbon isn't exactly thirst-quenching. I know well from my time in the service that exercise and drinking are poor bedfellows. Either way, I strongly suspect that had I walked downhill, I would have opened the bottle, and I'm quite certain that had I opened the bottle, I wouldn't be alive today. It's one of those little decisions that end up making a momentous impact. But regardless of whether or not I'd feel the bottles burn, I had no intention of making it to 650 days sober, because this day was to be my last. The woods were quiet and pleasant. Squirrels scuttled here and there, and there were plenty of birds. But that all changed rather abruptly. The blue sky hid behind clouds, even as the canopy thickened. Apparently the birds had business elsewhere, and the squirrels decided to play their games somewhere else. But I didn't think much about it at the time. Obviously, I was not expecting this walk to be cheery or uplifting, with just my thoughts and my dreaded cargo. Rather suddenly, I looked up, and I saw a little black shape in a tree above me. It was a black bear cub. Just one, and it was hugging the tree, stock still in its position, but trembling, and my adrenaline spiked. See, I have some experience with black bears. When I was a teenager, maybe 15 or 16, I had a strange encounter with one. Myself and several buddies were at a friend's house, in his basement, when we heard a noise by the wall. I assumed it was his cat messing around, but after a double take, we saw a very small black bear cub, casually sniffing around, which is a weird thing to see. A bear cub in a house. I realized it must have fallen into the basement through the window. Likely it smelled something, and pushed through the screen without realizing there was no floor beneath it. We barely had a moment to process that we were seeing a bear in the house, when the window erupted with snarls, as the mom was frantically moaning and growling, trying to force her way in. Given another 5 seconds, I have no doubt she would have forced her way through, but due to quick thinking of my buddy, he picked up the cub and shoved it out through a different window, and mama and baby went off without further incident. The whole thing lasted less than 10 seconds. We heard some noise, saw the baby, saw the mom, hoisted the baby up and out, and it was all over. But I'm telling you this because the threat of mama bears probably looms larger in my mind than most. The sight of a snarling bear trying to force its way through a window is not something you soon forget. I still remember the look of rage on her teeth, and I did not want to be exposed to it in the wild. So now, 15 years after that, there I was, with a stock-still, quivering black bear cub 10 feet above my head. And to make matters worse, this cub in the tree was significantly smaller than the one I saw as a teenager. That one had been the size of a raccoon. This one seemed hardly larger than a squirrel. All this and more flashed through my brain in a fraction of a second, and for some ridiculous reason, I muttered the word fudge. I immediately averted my gaze, as to not seem like I was looking at it. I knew that Mom must be nearby, and I had just taken another step when I heard a groan and a roar. Well, not really a roar. It was a moan. Really loud, consistent moaning. Then I heard heavy footfalls through leaves. At that time, I thought she was charging, even though I hadn't seen her, and I want to be clear about something. This cub was directly above me. In that exact moment, I could have touched the tree without even moving my arm. It sounded like Mama Bear would have to literally go through me just to get to her cub. And I had no idea what to do, and even in that instant of duress, I noticed a twisted irony in the fact that I was clueless on how to proceed. Ironic, if I'm even using that word right, that I'd spent a considerable amount of time in my life researching bear attacks and the like, and now that one was actually happening, I just didn't have a clue. I knew that normally they say make yourself look big and imposing, snap a bag or hurl your backpack, but being threatening just didn't seem like a wise option, being right between the bear and her cub. In hindsight, I guess that's not nearly as ironic as being killed by a bear en route to do it myself. I kept my eyes down, and my posture submissive. Again, I know they say to do the opposite with black bears, but I figured that since I was directly between her and her cub, no amount of yelling or arm waving would do any good. I thought my best option was to calmly leave the area, and yet despite that, I couldn't move a muscle. This all takes time to tell you, but it had only been a second or two since I saw the baby above me. And I still had yet to see the adult bear, because I kept my eyes down, and by then I realized that she wasn't charging me, or at least hadn't, because she would have been on me by then. But then she did. Up until that point, I think she had just been making noise, but then the groaning stopped, and I heard a large body galloping toward me, crashing through the brush. I'm not exactly sure why, but I still didn't look. I just didn't. I tucked my chin in my chest, still not wanting to run, but rather brace for terrible impact. But then I heard the bear skitter to a halt, and this was the first time I could pinpoint her location, because for some reason I was so dedicated to being frozen and looking dead at the ground. But by moving my eyes, and just the slightest tilt of my head, I could see her at my 2 o'clock, and she was farther away than I expected. But she indeed looked pissed. And there was a rut in the leaves where she had come to a stop, and she was just moaning and groaning and huffing. Also, she wasn't as large as I had been expecting. The bear I saw when I was a teenager was much larger. I'm no bearologist, but I'd guess this must have been her first brood. Don't get me wrong, she was still plenty capable of turning me into a man puddle, but I don't think she was much larger than me, if larger than me at all. And then the cub fell out of the tree. You know how in tense situations your brain can latch onto a small, and maybe trivial detail, almost like a little vacation or commercial from the terror of reality? Well, that happened to me here. That little bear flew like Superman. It fell with arms and legs splayed, snout pointed straight at its mama, looking as determined and on point as you could imagine. He looked so resolute and regal as he glided, resolute and ridiculous. And then to add to the humor, he bounced. To this day, during hard times, I think of the bouncing baby bear and smile. It glided to the ground on its belly in such a way that it's a crime that it didn't make a squeak like a chew toy. And after its bounce, it landed directly on its feet and bounded to its mom like a rabbit. Again, my face is still angled toward the ground, because I was worried that the mom would deal with me once she knew her kid was safe. But I could still see her there, 25 or 30 feet away, and it at least seemed like she wasn't interested in coming any further. And that's when I realized that she wasn't even positioned toward me, or her cub for that matter. She was looking past me, at my 10 o'clock, or just to my left, which I couldn't even see because I was looking at her to my right. Now, in that moment, I became quite positive that I had misinterpreted the situation entirely. I realized, or supposed, that the cub was in the tree to begin with because of a male bear. There is no greater threat to a bear cub than a male bear, and the little guy had been trembling when I first saw him. Maybe he had been up there for a long time, and if that was the case, then it couldn't have been because of me. He'd probably been exhausted from squeezing the trunk for dear life. And maybe the mama and a male had been duking it out below for an extended period of time. And as I'm thinking this, mom and cub took off. From what it seemed, the mother made no attempt to let the baby bear catch up with her. She took off like a shot, and the baby bear bounded after her, and I could hear the two bears getting farther away. I could almost hear the lack of wind, if that makes any sense. In hindsight, this sounds kind of silly, but for whatever reason, I was completely convinced that a male bear was about to come crashing down on me, convinced that a male bear was very close to me, waiting for me to make the first move so that it could reciprocate with overwhelming force, and as if awakening from a trance, and totally aware that the only weapons I possessed were only effective against me, I lurched in the direction of the threat, shouting as gutturally as I could manage, and that's when my stomach turned upside down. I expected to see a charging bear coming from the direction that the mom had been facing, but what I saw was much farther away than I thought it would have been, maybe 75 to 100 feet, and I could make out facial features. And this is important because had it been human, it would have been too far away for me to make out facial features. But I saw a somewhat large nose, a very long mouth, and though I didn't really see any lips, I could tell that the mouth line was in a weird grimace. It was 9 or 10 feet tall, and it was in a curiously exact aisle through the foliage. It was stooped, and holding a tree with a very big and very hairy hand. Its fur was amber, long and matted. It seemed disproportionately narrow at the shoulders for how tall it was. I looked at this thing for a minute, which was kind of surprising seeing as I was absolutely terrified. I just couldn't stop looking at it. I don't think it moved at all, but I could see its hair flowing in the wind, as gentle as the wind was. If I had to define its expression, I would say it looked angry, mad, or even disappointed. For reasons that are unclear to me to this day, I had the distinct impression that it didn't want to get any closer to me. And don't get me wrong, I was terrified beyond description, but I just had the impression that it was currently as close as it wanted to be. But that kind of changed when it moved. It leaned forward in a strange way. When it stooped forward, I saw its other arm, which I hadn't been able to see before, and this arm was bent, and the palm of the hand was flat on the small of its back. I associated as the way an elderly person would scold a child. I'm not saying that the creature was elderly, just that its posture was reminiscent to an elderly person. And when it stooped forward, its face contorted to what I'd call a snarl, and it reminded me of the look a frustrated parent gives a kid before saying something like, "I'm going to count to 3, almost a scolding look, and that's all I needed. I booked it, down the hill, the whole way I ran. I ran and ran and ran. I'm not exactly sure how long it had taken me to get to where I saw the bear cub. I'd guess about an hour from when I left the trail. Well, let me tell you, I was back at my car in 10 minutes, and I was absolutely giddy from the adrenaline. I had never run like that. Ever. Not even when I was in the army and I was supposed to. It felt like I was in slow motion. The wind and branches and leaves all sailed by me, and I was moving so fast, yet I could see everything in such vivid detail, even the veins of a falling leaf. And as I ran, my palms cut through the air as though they were rudders, steering me, like I was running with all fours. I felt like my flattened hands made contact with the wind in the same way that my feet made contact with the ground, and it was a liberating feeling to descend the mountain so fleet of foot. This sounds strange, but I'd never felt so free or so capable in all my life. And this is partly due to the downhill factor, but I doubt I'd ever run that fast in my whole life. I felt like I was in step with time, or even like I was outrunning time, because even though I was moving at breakneck speed, I could make out everything I was seeing with such extreme detail, almost like I wasn't even fast, but everything else was slow. I ran 200 paces past my car because I didn't have time to decelerate, and then I dry heaved for a spell. I specifically hadn't eaten that morning because I wanted my drunk to be good, and it was only then that I consciously realized that I must have dropped my maker's mark right before I started to run. And just to confirm what I already knew, I checked my cargo pocket, and the carefully coiled length of paracord was gone too. Unfortunately, my vapes were dead. Both of them. And I was shaking so much that I felt that buying a new one at the rest stop's gas station would be easier than plugging it into my car, with the way my hands were shaking. I walked into the gas station, grateful for the task, because I was too full of adrenaline or whatever hormone or chemical to drive with confidence. And as soon as I entered the neon-lit place, some of my glee evaporated, but not all of it. The woman behind the counter gave me a look that I had given plenty of times myself. She obviously thought I was a druggie or something, and I don't blame her, as I have no doubt that I was wild-eyed and breathless. I walked right up to the counter, looked her dead in the eye, and said, "I just saw a f***ing Sasquatch." And she was quiet for a moment, but then busted out laughing. And I laughed too. And by the time I got to my car, I nearly fell to pieces at how foreign and entirely alien my own laugh sounded to my ears. This wasn't a, oh, you know, living the dream kind of laugh. This was a belly laugh. And I haven't laughed like that in so long that I had to remind myself that it didn't belong to someone else. It was mine. I stumbled onto your channel recently, and now I feel like I'm not losing my mind. It's out there, and the people who don't believe simply don't believe it because they've never seen one, and they're trusting a bunch of other people who also haven't seen one. But I have. The majority of encounters you cover on your channel show the creatures as somewhere between benevolent and indifferent, as in, the Sasquatch are either good-spirited, or they simply aren't interested in the human witness. But that wasn't my experience. The creature I saw was intensely focused on me, and it didn't seem happy. And I honestly think, ironically maybe, that my life was in danger. It looked like it didn't want to come any closer, but that if it did, there would have been a big problem. And there is no doubt in my mind that the animal, or man-animal, whatever, could have ended me with very little effort. It was almost twice my height, and at least 3 or 4 times my mass, from what I could see, and it looked like it lived a hard life. I'd be lying if I said that my life is now nothing but sunshine and rainbows, but it is a whole lot better, which is so odd because for so long I was in a place with no light at all, and I don't even want to say this because it might jinx it, but I might actually be getting to the point of perpetual sunshine and rainbows. I'm getting closer every day. A good day is not hard to spot if you've been to the dark places that I've been. The key is to accept that you're not in control, and just take life minute by minute. It's a strange thing to know that I wouldn't be alive right now, were it not for the Bigfoot and the bears, or some combination of the two. The best thing about my life, at this point in time, is that I can't even relate to where my head was at in the weeks that led up to that fateful day in the mountains. It was just this dusky calm. It wasn't even sad or pain, it was just nothing, and the memory of that feeling now is like an unsettling dream that you can only remember the emotion of, and not the actual events. Anyway, that's my story. And it happened. And it's nice to know that there are a lot more stories like it, whether they're told or not. Okay, hi, back to me. One thing I want to note right off the bat, because I think it's relevant, is that it turns out that we got this illustration a little wrong. When the witness first sees it, it was holding a tree trunk with one arm, and because of how it was angled, the other arm was behind its body, so he couldn't see that part of it. This would have to be from the side. So when he first saw it, he saw it from the side, and then when it stooped forward, it put its hand on the small of its back. More like this picture. Like the universal symbol for back pain, kind of. So I just wanted to clarify that as it may be relevant. So the arm and hand that he couldn't see because of its angle was likely also holding a tree trunk, and then when it stooped forward, it placed the arm and hand that he could see on its lower back, and he still couldn't see the other arm, but he thinks it was holding a trunk. So the fact that it was holding a tree trunk with one hand and supporting its back with the other, to me, suggests that the creature he saw was either injured or elderly, which perhaps explains why it was interested in a bear cub. You know, it was still large enough to intimidate or separate a cub from its mother, but perhaps it wasn't well enough to go after more common prey, or more plentiful prey. Regarding the bear encounter, that's actually the most common type of aggressive encounter you can have with a black bear. It happens fairly frequently. When a person inadvertently stumbles between a black bear and her cubs. And I'm curious, in case you happen to be a bearologist, what do you think you're supposed to do in this situation? I have no idea what I would have done. The best advice I can find on the internet is, don't, which isn't too terribly helpful. Do you think he did the right thing by being still and avoiding eye contact in a submissive fashion? I don't know, but he lived it, and I didn't, so I'd be foolish to think I'd know better. Anyway, this Bigfoot encounter is the kind I both love and hate. It has all the quintessential aspects of a Bigfoot encounter, or granted, any hair-raising wildlife encounter, as in, replace the Bigfoot with a moose or a mountain lion, and you have just about the same story, which I always find credible. And yet, it has the human element that makes you wonder if the context can possibly be a coincidence. There are numerous accounts of Sasquatch appearing in times of great duress, but does that mean that the Sasquatch phenomena is a psychological thing? And if it is psychological, does that mean it's not real, or merely a different kind of real? Many paranormal or mystic or mythic anomalies are considered harbingers, omen-tellers, as in something that knows what's about to happen and then seeks to influence the outcome with said knowledge. Was this creature somehow aware of the witness's mental trauma, and was it acting as some kind of spiritual protector, or was it simply a right place and right time type of thing? A coincidence? Honestly, I'm inclined to lean to the latter. At least that's what I'd like to think. Zoologically speaking, I'd guess that this was an older individual, and bear cub was on the menu, and its hunt was interrupted. Perhaps the hunt was even partially completed, seeing as a single bear cub is fairly rare. But if we're to believe that these creatures are more on the human end of things, that is, more like us. Perhaps it heard the commotion and wanted to ensure that a person wasn't in trouble with a bear. We tend to have a desire to help other primates. Maybe it would too. Or maybe it was simply curious about human-bear interaction and wanted to observe the outcome with no regard for the well-being of either species. I find the purely cryptozoological aspect of these creatures comforting. I'd like to think that these creatures are merely a highly developed ape that in many ways mimic human capabilities, improved on the parts that we lack, and bypassed many of our weaknesses, like materialism, avarice, and most importantly, our biological imperative to manufacture our surroundings into an allegedly suitable habitat. That's what I like to think Bigfoot is, and it very well may be. But then stories or encounters like this come about, and they are many. Well, a lot of people call these things Nephilim, which are angels, fallen angels, but angels nonetheless. Bigfoot, in some similar form, exists in almost all cultures, as of course does the notion of the guardian angel. How would your guardian angel feel if you took a stroll to the woods for a quick drop and a sudden stop, and then somehow managed to get attacked by a bear in the process? I think that, quote, scolding, as the witness said, would be an appropriate description for your guardian angel's condition. Or was it merely the witness's subconscious that put the meaning to a very real and pragmatically minded creature that cared nothing about his well-being? Or maybe it did care about his well-being while still being flesh and blood. We typically care about the well-being of small things we stumble upon. Why wouldn't it? And that's why I said that this man's experience is the quintessential Bigfoot encounter. There are just so many angles and so many ways to look at it that it quickly becomes dizzying. But to be clear, none of that was the witness's interpretation. He believes that the favor the creature performed that day was entirely inadvertent. He thinks he walked into something that he was not to be a part of, and I can't tell if that's comforting or not. I like to think that Sasquatch cares about us. Regardless of what you think, he's quite convinced that he wouldn't be alive today were it not for this creature's intervention, be it by bear or by rope. Whatever you think, it certainly acted as his guardian angel that day. Therefore, I think it's safe to call it that. Perhaps we have guardian angels, and I guess the question becomes, do we want them or not? It doesn't seem like we have a choice in the matter. Anyway, feel free to let me know what you make of this story. Make sure to like the video, and subscribe for soon-to-come content, because I'm working on several videos about some intriguing evidence that I'm pretty excited about. And as always, thanks an awful lot for listening.